So we're continuing on with our study, our exploration of the story of Esther, looking for the hidden king and where the hidden king comes out in that story. Last week, we were at kind of a pivotal scene last week, the climax, as it's oftentimes called and referred to within a story, in which we saw Esther at that second banquet finally revealing herself, revealing who she was and what was going on, and what was really sort of the case there, what Haman had done. We saw Haman arrested. We saw at the very end, we read about Haman being executed on a pole that he had originally set up to execute Mordecai. And it seems like, for all intents and purposes, we might be inclined at this point to say, look, it's done. Everything's done. Everything's been taken care of. The bad guy has been dealt with. He's gone. He's out of the picture. We don't need to worry about it anymore, right? Done deal. We can wrap this bad boy up and call it good because Haman's gone. That's not exactly the case. Not in the story of Esther, not at this point quite yet, because there's still two problems yet, so to speak, two problems that still need to be dealt with in this story. And the first one has to do with the fact that there's this edict that is still hanging out there to annihilate the Jews. And it's an edict, when we first saw it, when we first read about it, way back in one of the early chapters of Esther, it was an edict that was explicitly said, this is an unchangeable edict. It's irrevocable. You can't overturn it. You can't do away with it. It's been signed by the king. It's been sealed with his ring. It's permanent. And so it still seems like we still have this issue hanging there where Israel is still in danger. That needs to be dealt with. That's one problem that still comes up here. The other problem is connected to sort of this theme that's been kind of that's been woven throughout the story, and it has to do with this relationship between the Benjamite tribe of Israel and the Agagites. Remember, Haman, all throughout the story so far, has been referred to as Haman the Agagite. And there's been a big connection here. And Mordecai himself was described early on as a Benjamite. And there's this tension that has existed ever since the Exodus, really, ever since the desert and the wandering around the desert, between Israel, in this case represented by the Benjamites, and the Amalekites, who were led by King Agag, where we get the term Agagite from. There's this rivalry that exists here that God is still working out. He still needs to deal with and bring closure to that aspect of the story. And while Haman, the Agagite, may now be out of the picture, we know that he still has sons. 10 sons, to be exact. The Agagites are still around. That line has not come to an end yet. That's problem number 2. God still needs to finish and tie up these loose ends in the story of Esther that he's been working on for a long time now. So Esther chapter 8 this morning is where we're going. Let me pray a second for God to bless our time, and then we'll take a look at Esther chapter 8. Heavenly Father, Lord, pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, Lord, that we may see, that we may hear, that we may understand, that we may be changed and transformed and encouraged and challenged by what we read this morning, Lord. Speak to us through your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Esther chapter 8 this morning. Esther chapter 8. And despite what the bulletin and the slide says, we're not going to go all the way through the chapter. We're going to end a couple of verses short and attach that onto next week. But Esther chapter 8. So that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. I'm going to stop there for a second, because one of the things that comes out in this chapter is, while last chapter was considered the climax of the story of Esther, chapter 8 in many ways is oftentimes labeled as the great reversal of Esther. This is the point in which God is now very much reversing everything that has been building up. We've seen this build up, we've seen hints, we've seen just kind of, little shadows in many ways of things, reversals that are coming. And now in chapter 8, we finally get to this great reversal in which everything seems to actually be made, right in many ways. And while we already have 2 smaller reversals that come up in these first 2 verses already, and that one is that in these first 2 verses, Haman's reputation changes and gets reversed. You see, now Haman is now being described in verse 1, Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Now, all throughout the story so far, Haman has not been described as the enemy of anybody, really. He's been described in more positive terms, usually something along the lines of the king's most trusted advisor, the second in command, something more positive than that. Haman, if all had gone the way that he had planned it, and if it wasn't for the fact that God has been sort of silently working in the shadows of this story, history would have gone down. Haman would have gone down in history as a hero of the Persian Empire. He would have gone down in history as the man who ridded the Persian Empire of the greatest threat, the greatest internal threat to that empire. Because Israel would have been destroyed, and that would have been the end of it. Haman would have been a hero. But that's not how it turns out. Instead, because of everything that's been happening, and especially because of the way God has been working here, Haman's reputation, his legacy, is reversed. And he now becomes the enemy of the Jews. And he goes down in history with that label. There's also a second reversal that might be a bit more important, a bit bigger in terms of where this story goes. And that has to do with Mordecai here in verse 2 already. That Mordecai is given Haman's position. So Haman has he's been the underdog. He's been the weakling. He's been the one who's been oppressed and shamed and really kind of put down and spit on and kicked on and everything else. And now here we have Mordecai being given Haman's position as number 2 in the kingdom. And that becomes an important piece of where the story goes. So verse 3. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it right, the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? And King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole that he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So we got a couple of reversals that have already happened in those first 2 verses of chapter 8, and now we get to the big one. Now we've got to deal with this edict. And that's really kind of the big one that's really at focus here in chapter 8. What to do about this edict to annihilate and to destroy the Jews. And so Esther again goes to Xerxes, again falls down before him, and again begs him, Xerxes, look, I get it, okay? I'm glad that all of this has kind of worked out the way it is, but we still need to do with this. My people are still in danger. I'm still in danger. You got to do something. You got to change this. You got to turn this around and overrule this original edict. And Xerxes says, well, no, I can't. It was sealed with my ring. I can't do that. It's just not in my ability to carry out that sort of a thing. I can't do that. He says, but what I can do is this. I gave Mordecai Haman's authority. I'm giving Mordecai sort of, that special place. He is now the keeper of the ring. Mordecai, you go, you do what you think is best. And this is kind of funny because this is exactly the sort of thing that kind of got Xerxes in trouble to begin with, that got even Israel in trouble to begin with. He told Haman went and complained to him about something, and Xerxes said, Haman, just do whatever you think is best. Just go ahead. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not even going to pay attention to it. You got my ring. Take care of it. And now he's doing the exact same thing with Mordecai. Now, I get it that Xerxes is one of the greatest and most powerful rulers that the world has ever known, but he was far from most intelligent. He keeps making the same mistake over and over and over again. He keeps doing some really dumb things by giving people control and and giving them the right to speak for him. But that's what he does. That's what he does here with Mordecai. Again, he says, go out and do something different. Make some change, whatever you think is best. But because it can't be revoked, the original edict cannot be revoked, that change, this new edict, Mordecai's edict, has to take more the form of an amendment to that original edict. This is kind of like the way that politics in this country works, right? I mean, we just went through this election. We see this happening all the time. See, and it's not that Xerxes really didn't have the authority. I mean, granted, it was sort of customary that the king would never reverse a decision, but it's not that he couldn't. I mean, he was Xerxes. He could go and say, you know what, everybody? I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We gotta throw that one out. It's not that he couldn't do that. It's just nobody wants to follow a king that changes their mind. Nobody wants to follow a king that goes on the record and says, oh, by the way, I made a mistake. And you ever notice how even in politics in our own country, our politicians, they don't admit that they make mistakes, at least not very often. You know, they might do some law that might seem like a good idea at the time or might seem like the right one at the time, but then over time, things start to come out and you start to realize that was really a pretty bad thing to pass. And they don't go back and they say, well, you know what, this was a bad idea, we made a mistake, so we're going to throw it out. No, they just pass more amendments to kind of tack onto that original one to sort of try to change things. And then you get this huge mess of this legal code that nobody wants to read and it really has no idea what's even in it. That's kind of what we have going on here too. Xerxes says, well, I'm not going to change my mind. I'm not going to admit I'm wrong, but make an amendment. Mordecai, write an amendment to this. Sign off on it. You got my permission, and that's the way it's going to be. This is an amendment to try and deal with the mistake of the first one. So Mordecai does that. He does that, and this is what he says, verse 9. At once, the royal secretaries were summoned, and on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. That's the same day that was in the original edict for wiping out Israel. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. So Mordecai's edict, or Mordecai's amendment in many ways, what it does is it takes this situation that was originally, basically, let's just call it what it was. Originally it was state-sponsored genocide, and he turns it into state-sponsored civil war without any help from the government to deal with that. That's essentially what he does here. It's essentially what's going on here in the story of Esther. He says, okay, well, I can't overturn it, so the Jews are in danger, but now I'm going to give them the right to defend themselves. Now I'm going to give them the right to fight back. But there are some pretty significant differences really that kind of come into this when you compare this Mordecai's edict with Haman's edict. And a lot of it does revolve around this idea of defending themselves. See, Haman's edict, way back in the day, Haman's edict was all about giving the Persians the right to actively go out and hunt down and pursue any Israelite and kill them and their children and take their property and everything else. Mordecai's edict doesn't do that. Mordecai's edict doesn't say, well, now in order to get back, in order to, do justice, kind of thinking back to what we talked about last week a little bit, in order to get to, to do justice, I'm not going to give Israel the right to attack back. I'm going to give Israel the right to defend themselves. See, in the original edict, Israel didn't have the right to defend themselves. They really just kind of had to sit there. If their Persian neighbor came busting through their door with a sword, they had to just sit there and take it. They couldn't defend themselves. And if they defended themselves, they'd be breaking the law and they'd probably be arrested and killed anyways. So, they were really pretty out of luck. Now, Israel has the right to defend themselves, but not to go on the attack. That's pretty significant. It echoes, in many ways, what we saw happening last week with Esther. when Esther went to Xerxes in the second banquet before Xerxes and Haman and went and pleaded before Xerxes her case, pleaded for her life, she didn't come right out and say Haman was responsible. That eventually came out, but only by Xerxes prodding. Esther didn't go to Xerxes looking for revenge, looking to kill Haman. She just simply went looking for justice. Mordecai, in many ways, is doing the same thing with Israel. He's saying, you're not being given permission to go out and get revenge. That's God's doing. That's not your doing. That's God's doing. You are being given permission to make things right, to defend yourself. You can attack, but only if you are attacked first. That is a major, major issue here. And let's take a look at why. And in order to get at the why, in order to get at why that is such a big deal and why that is so important for really kind of understanding what's going on here in chapter 8, you have to try and wrap your heads around what's going on here and what this looks like through Israel's eyes. Okay, so a little bit of kind of historical context here, and I've talked about this before. Israel is in Persia all because of the Babylonian captivity. So way back in the day when Israel was their own nation and being self-governed, they had this tendency of constantly flip-flopping back and forth between worshiping God and worshiping other gods, or worshiping other gods at the same time as worshiping God. And after a while, God just got sick of me and said, you know what, you guys need to be disciplined. And so I'm going to send the Babylonian, actually I'm not going to send, I'm going to allow the Babylonian army to come in and to take care of you. They're going to destroy my temple, they're going to destroy Jerusalem, they're going to march a whole bunch of you off to Babylon, and that's just the way it's going to be. And you're going to be there for a while, and eventually, we'll come back. And so the reason why Israel is in Persia to begin with is because of this Babylonian captivity. After Babylon, Persia came in, defeated Babylon, and that's why it's now Persia instead of Babylon. So back then, back when Israel was still self-governed and still living in Jerusalem, still living in Israel, in the territory of Israel, they were God's people, and they understood that, especially when it came to doing things like going to war. So if you go to war, if Israel went to war, they went to war always with this understanding that God was fighting this war ahead of them. God was going before them to fight this war. And so when Israel would put their army together and line up on the line and get ready to go and fight these people, they were doing it with this confidence and this faith that really all they were doing is just mopping up after God had already done the heavy fighting. It wasn't really their war, it was God's war to fight, and they were just there just to do the cleanup work. And they went in with that faith and that confidence. And also connected to that, Israel fell into this trap that a lot of countries